more or less okay. In fact, her first ever novel, which is called Harriet Said, which wasn't published immediately, but it was returned to her by one publisher with a note which said that your characters are repulsive almost beyond belief. And I think, well, actually, I agree with one half of it. She does like sort of warped and miserable characters, but I believe in them. I believed in all these characters.
Absolutely. It was so beautifully written. The world was so vivid. It was so real. I've been in that house. You know, I can tell you the layout of that house, and the front room where they don't really use because it's got all the good stuff in, so no one ever sort of goes. All these details of like of family history in Liverpool.
Somebody told a character gave us information that we'd already heard from another character, but with their perspective of it. I thought that was so clever because suddenly we saw sort of an event from a different point of view, or information from a different point of view, and it kind of added to the claustrophobia of like hearing the same story again and again and the arguments. And I thought the character, I thought it was really, really funny just how they all loved the neighbour. You know, the really glamorous neighbour. She could do no wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And at the start I was thinking, are we supposed to not like her? They all were seemingly just, and I thought there was something really weird and relatable about it.
The problem I had was, I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but needless to say, there's an incident at the end, and then the book stops. And that was when I thought it was getting interesting. That's when I wanted to see how all those characters who I now knew were going to react to that set of circumstances. And it just goes, no, that's the end of the book. And it's like, oh, come on, Beryl, you know.
We've been talking about The Dressmaker by Beryl Bainbridge, which is until next year, when the days will be getting longer. I'm afraid that's it. But if you're wondering about books to give for Christmas, all is well. Just search for a good read online or via the BBC Sounds app, and you'll find an abundance of suggestions from guests as various as Geoffrey Archer, George the Poet, Lolly Adefope or Meg Rosoff. For now, though, a big thank you to today's guests, John Higgs and Gonya Maguire. And to you, as always, thanks for listening.
A Good Read was presented by Harriet Gilbert and produced in Bristol by Beth O'D. That was the last in the present series, but as Harriet said, there are hundreds of editions to download from BBC.
Hello there. Deal or delay? Slowly creeping into the conversation is the idea that if elections is today in Mississippi, and it's an election runoff in which the state can't escape its history.
There's a difference in a public hanging and a lynching. She's referring to a lawful execution. And the way she made her comment, if the gentleman invited her to a public hanging, she would be on the front row.
Well, we don't have public hangings.
We need to. We need to.
And as the nights get longer, we hear from Tromsø in Norway, where the sun has set until the 15th of January. With the BBC News throughout the hour, Mairead Devlin.
Theresa May has visited Wales and Northern Ireland at the start of a drive to sell her Brexit deal, but she faced a warning that the agreement is doomed. A close ally of the Prime Minister, Sir Michael Fallon, described it as the worst of all worlds. But Mrs May insisted the deal was the best available. Our political correspondent Chris Mason reports.
This morning she met farmers, among others, at the Royal Welsh Winter Fair in Builth Wells in Powys. Conservatives in government accused Theresa May of giving up on getting a better Brexit deal. Sir Michael Fallon, for so long a loyal defender of the government, was brutally direct. President Trump characteristically blunt, suggesting the deal was better for the EU and could stop a UK-US trade deal. Mrs May insisted
failings after a driver ploughed into a supermarket in Coventry, killing 2 people. Midland Red had pleaded guilty to 2 offences by allowing 77-year-old Kailash Chunder to continue working despite warnings about the pensioners driving. One of the victims was 7-year-old Rowan Fitzgerald, a solicitor representing the boy's Parliament for Change. Mr Conway argues that a blanket ban on assisted dying is an unjustified interference with his human rights. A toddler was among 18 migrants who've been rescued from 2 small boats in the English Channel. It's the latest in a series of attempts by migrants to reach the UK in recent weeks. From Dover, Simon Jones reports.
Despite repeated warnings on both sides of the channel that people are putting their lives at risk trying to cross the busiest shipping lane in the world, this morning 2 more groups of migrants made the attempt. One small boat was spotted by a passing ferry 6 miles off the Kent coast. The 9 people on board were taken to Dover. At around the same time, a fishing boat carrying another 9 migrants was located off Dunkirk. They were taken back to France. More than 100 migrants have reached the UK in small boats in the past month. Most have claimed to be from Iran.
A UN report has warned that efforts to prevent dangerous climate change will fail unless countries radically change their energy policies. The study says global greenhouse gas emissions must peak by 2020 and decline significantly by 2030 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Vegan activists in Brighton.
Theresa May does not have a planet-sized level of support for her deal. If anything, gravity is against her at the moment. She hasn't given up. We'll hear more about that later. But people are now inevitably looking beyond the deal at what might happen next, and hoving into view the idea of delay. Just to be clear, do you think they actually bother with the vote? Because often it's said if the government knows it's going to lose a vote, it tries to avoid it and preempt it. But do you think they'll go ahead? They'll get to the 11th?
Absolutely. That's the number one priority, certainly from the Prime Minister down, everyone in her team. They actually don't like talking about there being a second vote. Obviously you wouldn't. No government likes to do that. But equally, you know, there is an odd determination around the Prime Minister, not confidence I'd say, but a determination that somehow they're actually going to get this through on the first vote. Now we all laugh at that, we all think that's bonkers, but don't forget, you know, there is some time to go. There's some way in which possibly they could not persuade people through patronage, but sheer entreaty, shall we say, that actually this is in the national interest. And don't forget, someone like Ken Clarke, surprisingly to my mind, Ken Clarke has actually come out in favour of this deal. Now he's well known to be a very much pro-European Tory. I think that actually, yeah, let's try and possibly include the idea of an extension and maybe vote for one. Some of them, I have to say, are still pretty hard line. They say, look, you know, that would be completely reneging on what the British public were promised. March 29th is exit day. That's why it's written into the bill. Don't forget, David Davis insisted on that date being written into the legislation. However, I've been talking to Labour, and it's clear one of the first things they're going to try and do when they amend this big vote, the meaningful vote on December the 11th, is an amendment which will suggest an extension to Article 50. And at the moment, the real process is whether or not it will be so-called in scope in parliamentary terms, whether or not it will be allowed by the parliamentary clerks. But they're in deep discussions about that to try and make it work. And then it gets very interesting. It gets interesting because the amendments are almost certainly going to come before the big vote. So before the yes or no on May's deal, you'll have this amendment, this suggestion, will we really...
We're talking like it's up to us, right? And of course, there is a legal case that the government should be able or have the right to well be, that the Europeans will say, look, we're happy for you to delay Article 50 if it's around another referendum or if it's around a parliamentary timetable. To say we're going to delay it in order that you can come back and have another bite at the negotiation after 2 years in which, you know, the country struggled to make up its mind as to what it wanted. I mean, it's a big ask, isn't it? I mean, what are they going to say?
It really is difficult because Brussels, obviously, their gambit, they're in lockstep with the Prime Minister at the moment. Unusually, they're saying, look, of course we're not going to unpick this deal. You can forget it. You know, it's taken 18 months to get here, etc. But, you know, some realists, I think, some people within government I've talked to say that actually, yeah, that's the position, that's the public position. But obviously, the last thing the EU wants really is no deal of any kind, and they'll do anything to avoid that.
Just a quick last one. We're talking about this big vote on the 11th. People who want to insert a delay or to avoid no deal, which would be what happens if you don't delay and you've not got any other option, they've got lots of ways of getting it in, haven't they, without this vote? I mean, they've got, because the government actually has to get legislation through between now and March.
That's really important, and that's why I've been talking to people within government and also within the opposition. And again, curiously, there's this unholy alliance. The threat to the hardline Brexiteers is, look, if you really vote this down, this will come back. The idea of an extension of Article 50, the idea of a softer Brexit, will come back in the form of amendments to the trade bill, to the immigration bill, to the withdrawal bill itself. And this idea of guerrilla warfare, even after this big vote in 2 weeks' time, that continuing, that's what really, really worries a lot of people.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. Right, it's exactly 5:15. Let's just get the latest news with Mairead Devlin.
The DUP leader, Arlene Foster, has joined mounting criticism of the Brexit deal, accusing Theresa May of having given up on getting a better agreement. The Prime Minister, who began a national tour to sell the deal, insisted it was the best agreement available. A bus company has been fined almost £2.5 million after it ignored warnings about a driver who crashed into a supermarket, killing 2 people. A terminally ill man has called for a change in the law on assisted dying after the Supreme Court refused to hear his appeal.
Thanks, Mairead. Now, for several years, we've been used to seeing pictures of migrants heading to Europe in overcrowded boats. At times, it seemed that there's no way. Because the numbers have spiked, it's become a near daily experience. This morning, 9 people, including a child, reported to be 18 months old, were picked up off Dover. 2 days ago, 8 people, all suffering from hypothermia, rescued by the French authorities. The day before, 5 suspected migrants were picked up from a small boat by the French authorities of northern France. The day before, 8 men located in a dinghy off the coast of Dover, and on and on. Now, in fact, it turns out Brexit has had some impact, perhaps wrongly persuading people that they need to get in now, or that they'll never make it. BBC reporter Chris Campbell has been to France to get the inside story from a migrant camp.
Inflatable dinghy.
A boat that will cost you £3,000 to £4,000. I'm taking 3 people with me. They pay in cash. We get a boat and off we go.
The smuggler says he was a fisherman in Iran and shows us a picture of himself on a boat. Getting across the channel, he says, would be easy.
Look, I will check the weather. You have waves in the sea. Ferries cross the water, and they can drag you underneath them even if you're 1 kilometer away. But I know the sea routes where you will not be disrupted by the ferries.
More than 100 migrants have been found trying to reach the Kent coast by boat in the last 3 weeks. At a squalid camp near Calais, I spoke to Farhad from Afghanistan, who was put in a dinghy with 11 others. He was rescued at night after the engine stalled.
It was freezing a couple of days ago, and when you get wet, we were full wet. I was like that to myself. A couple of guys, they actually fainted, you know, they fainted, they were sleeping, and we're trying to wake them up. And we're trying to wake them up because their hearts will stop from the cold.
Another migrant told me the boat he was in capsized after being battered by waves. The migrants I spoke to claim they fled their home countries because of religious and political persecution. Their desperation to get to the UK is being fueled by fears of Brexit. There is a rush.
Everybody's talking about it in here in the jungle. They're like that, we need to get in quicker, you know what I'm saying, in case the security gets tied up.
Even as winter sets in and temperatures start to plummet here, migrants in this part of north of France are continuing to prepare to cross this treacherous stretch of water. It's happening at night time in the dark, and they're using their mobile phones to navigate across to the Kent coast.